Blue lights flash in your rearview mirror. Not a gentle flicker, not a maybe. It's unmistakable. Your chest tightens just a little. You slow down, signal, pull over. The engine hums quietly as you stop. Then there's that moment, that pause, where nothing happens yet, but everything already feels like it has. You glance at your side mirror. The officer steps out, slow, measured, watching you. And then it happens. Not the first question you expect, but something else. Passenger, step out of the vehicle. Now everything just changed. Have you ever been in a situation where a police officer told a passenger to step out, and you weren't sure if that was normal or if something was about to go wrong? Tell me in the comments what happened in your case, because I'm going to explain something most people misunderstand about that exact moment, and once you hear it, you'll start seeing these stops very differently. Let's talk about what's really going on here, because this isn't random. Officers don't just make moves like that for no reason, even when it feels sudden or unnecessary. There's a method behind it, and if you don't understand that method, you can easily say the wrong thing, move the wrong way, or unintentionally escalate a situation that didn't need to go there. Picture this. You're driving with a friend. It's late afternoon, traffic is light. You get pulled over for something minor, maybe a rolling stop, maybe a broken tail light. Nothing dramatic. You're expecting the usual: license, registration, maybe a warning or ticket. The officer walks up, but instead of focusing only on you, they scan the entire vehicle. That's something people forget. Officers aren't just talking to the driver, they're reading the entire scene. Who's moving? Who's avoiding eye contact? Who's reaching for something too quickly? Who looks nervous and who looks too calm? Then suddenly the officer says, "Passenger, can you step out for me?" Most people freeze right there. The driver looks over. The passenger looks confused, and in that confusion, mistakes start happening. Here's the part that people don't talk about enough. Legally, in many situations, officers do have the authority to order passengers out of the vehicle during a traffic stop. That comes from a line of court decisions that basically say officer safety allows for some control over the scene. But just because they can ask doesn't mean you should treat it casually or respond without thinking. Because how you respond in that exact moment matters more than you think. Let's slow this down. The passenger hears, "Step out of the vehicle." Now what usually happens? They either immediately comply without saying anything, or they panic and say something like, "Why? What did I do?" Both responses can lead to very different outcomes depending on tone, timing, and what the officer is already thinking. And this is where I'm going to give you something practical, something you can actually say in that moment that changes the dynamic without escalating it. Before stepping out, a calm, steady response like this can make a difference. "Officer, just to be clear, am I being detained or am I free to go?" That question does a few things at once. It shows awareness, not aggression, not defiance, just awareness. It forces clarity without confrontation, and most importantly, it makes the officer define the situation. Now here's where it gets interesting. If the officer says, "You're being detained," then the situation is no longer casual. There's a legal basis for keeping that passenger there, and everything that follows needs to be handled carefully. If the officer says, "No, you're not detained," then it raises a different question entirely. Why are they being asked to step out? And this is where many people make a critical mistake. They assume that if they're not being detained, they can argue their way out of the situation. That's not how this works in the real world. You can be legally correct and still make things worse. Let me explain what I mean. Officers are trained to control uncertainty. A traffic stop is unpredictable. They don't know who you are, what you might have, or what your intentions are. So when they ask a passenger to step out, it's often about reducing variables, separating people, observing behavior individually, watching reactions. Now imagine the passenger responds with attitude. "Why do I have to get out? I didn't do anything." Even if that's true, the tone alone can shift the officer's perception. Now it's not just a routine stop. Now there's resistance. And resistance, even verbal, often leads to more control measures. On the other hand, silence can also be misread. If the passenger says nothing, avoids eye contact, moves slowly or awkwardly, the officer might interpret that as nervousness or concealment. This is why the wording matters. Calm, clear, neutral. Am I being detained or am I free to go? No attitude, no challenge, just a question. Now let's take this deeper, because this is where things get complicated. Sometimes officers will ignore that question. They'll repeat the command. Step out of the vehicle. This is one of those moments where people get frustrated. They feel like their rights are being brushed aside, and emotionally, that reaction makes sense. But practically, this is not the moment to push. Because refusal, even if you believe you're in the right, can escalate into physical removal. And once it becomes physical, everything changes. Now you're dealing with use of force justifications, compliance issues, and a situation that can spiral quickly. So here's the reality most people don't want to hear. You can assert your awareness, but you still need to comply in the moment. Step out slowly. Keep your hands visible. Don't make sudden movements. And then, this is key, you continue to protect yourself with your words, not your resistance. Once outside, you can ask again calmly, am I being detained? Now let's talk about something people overlook. The officer isn't just listening to your words, they're watching your timing. Do you interrupt? Do you hesitate too long? Do you look around as if searching for something? Do you keep reaching toward your pockets? Every small movement builds a narrative in the officer's mind, and that narrative influences everything, whether they escalate, whether they search, whether they call for backup. Let me give you a scenario that happens more often than you think. Passenger steps out. Officer starts casual conversation. Where are you guys coming from? Where are you headed? Do you have anything illegal on you? Now this feels like small talk. It's not. It's a fishing phase. They're looking for inconsistencies. They're watching how quickly you answer. They're comparing your answers to the driver's answers. If the driver said you're coming from work and you say you're coming from a friend's house, that mismatch can trigger suspicion. And once suspicion builds, the stop gets longer. More questions, maybe a search request. Now here's where people trip themselves up. They think being talkative will help. So they over-explain. They add details. They try to sound cooperative. But the more you talk, the more material you give. A simple, respectful boundary works better. I'd prefer not to answer any questions. Say it calmly, no attitude, no sarcasm. Because here's the truth. You're not required to answer investigative questions during a traffic stop as a passenger in most situations. But how you assert that matters. If you say it defensively, it raises tension. If you say it calmly, it sets a boundary without escalating. Now let's address something uncomfortable. Sometimes officers will push anyway. They'll repeat the question differently. They'll change tone. Look, I'm just trying to figure out what's going on. If you've got nothing to hide, why not just answer? That line right there has pressured a lot of people into talking when they didn't need to. And it sounds reasonable. It feels reasonable. But it's a psychological tactic. Because the truth is, having nothing to hide doesn't mean you need to explain yourself. And once you start explaining, you're in their lane. You're playing their game. Now let's go back to the original moment, the command to step out. Why that moment matters so much is because it sets the tone for everything that follows. If the passenger reacts emotionally, the stop tightens. If the passenger reacts calmly but cluelessly, the officer takes more control. But if the passenger responds with calm awareness, measured compliance, and controlled speech, the entire dynamic shifts. Not always dramatically, not always immediately, but enough to matter. And here's something else people don't think about. When a passenger steps out, the driver is still being watched. Officers often use separation to compare behavior. Does the driver look back repeatedly? Do they start moving around inside the car? Do they seem more nervous now? Every reaction becomes part of the puzzle. So if you're the driver and your passenger is stepping out, your job is simple. Stay still, hands visible, no sudden movements. Because one small mistake, like reaching into the glove compartment without being asked, can completely change how the officer sees the situation. Let me tell you about a mistake that turns routine stops into serious problems. Passengers stepping out and immediately putting their hands in their pockets. It sounds minor, right? But from an officer's perspective, that's a red flag. Hands are everything in a traffic stop. If they can't see your hands, they don't know what you're doing. So what happens? Take your hands out of your pockets. Now the tone changes, the tension rises, and suddenly, something that started as a simple request becomes a controlled, high-alert interaction, all because of a small, unconscious movement. This is why I keep emphasizing awareness, not fear, not paranoia, awareness. Because these stops are not just about law, they're about perception, behavior, and split-second judgments. And here's the part I want you to really think about. Most people don't get into trouble because they're doing something illegal. They get into trouble because they don't understand how quickly a situation can shift. A simple question turns into repeated questioning. A casual request turns into a command. A minor stop turns into a prolonged investigation. And it often starts with one moment. Passenger, step out of the vehicle. So the next time you hear that, don't panic. Don't argue, don't over-explain. Pause for half a second, stay calm, and say it clearly. Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go? Then listen carefully to what happens next. Because what comes after that, that's where the real story begins.